with all the research, so there's a ton coming. I'm just going to continue again talking about the underlying foundation, so the biblical foundation for all of this. Again, going back to what is God doing? What's the big grand story of what God is doing? We started this morning talking about one aspect of God's purpose is for us to bear the image of God. And to go back, let's go back to Genesis chapter 1. And I want to propose that there are three things. So there's one, bearing the image of God. Two is multiplying the image of God. And third is subduing and ruling. And it kind of goes to what is the whole gospel, because I think that goes to the idea of making this world better. Okay? Hang with me while I unpack these for us for a bit. Let me go back and read that passage from Genesis again. That God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, and they may rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the sky, over the livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and over everything, or every living creature that moves on the ground." So first we talked about the image of God. What is the image of God? The image of God is this beautiful, complex thing, right? And so when we engage with people, or even with ourselves, there's the reflection of the fullness of the image of God. And that only comes in relationship with God. That God walks with us. When he walked in the garden, he walks with us. And in the end, you read Revelation, God is going to be with us. He's going to be with his people. Now the second thing, so we talk about the image of God, but the second mandate is, God says, "Be fruitful and increase in number." Now, this commandment was given pre-fall. And when God gave a pre-fall commandment, if the fall did not happen, if sin did not happen, what would happen? Adam and Eve would have babies, and the whole earth would be filled with people that reflected the image of God. Now here's the thing, God's plans never change, right? They never change. God's purposes, rather, never change. And so God's purpose was always to fill the earth with the image of God. I actually really think this passage, that verse, is the first statement of the Great Commission. What was God's purpose? To fill the earth with the image of God. Jump with me to Matthew chapter 28, right? The Great Commission. "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." What is a disciple? A disciple is someone who looks like his master, who bears the image of his master. So what is God intending? God is intending for us to multiply and fill the earth with, now because of Jesus and the redemptive work in us, we are called to multiply the image. And now it's not just having baby. I mean, everybody who's having kids knows that just having baby isn't necessarily multiplying the image of God as God talked about it. But seeing them come to faith and grow in faith, that's multiplying the image of God. Now it's really fascinating to me, and we come from Crew, and we always talk about evangelism and discipleship. The terms evangelism and discipleship are honestly, they're a little bit of a Western construct. If you look at the Great Commission, the biblical concept is actually disciple making. Go and make disciples. That's the whole process. See, what we try and do is we try and draw these lines. We try and get somebody over the line. But let me ask you this question. When did the disciples come to faith? When did the disciples come to faith? When Jesus first called them and they responded. And here's Peter. Jesus is about to go to the cross, and he's trying to convince Jesus not to go to the cross. I mean, how much did Peter actually understand the gospel, if that's the case? And so I think one of the most beautiful things about even this is a journey. I think in many ways God's far more concerned about our direction than he is even concerned about where we are, the lines. In fact, when it comes to even things like decisions for Christ, Tim Keller says this way. He says, he reckons most decisions for Christ are not genuine conversions, but rather a commitment to a process. Why? Because this is a journey. And so you see these people, as we talk about the scale of belief, it's far more about how do we see direction on that scale of belief. And if we see God's purposes as disciple-making, I'm not saying that the idea of evangelism and discipleship isn't helpful to think of it that way. But the biblical concept is rather one continuous process. It's not just, oh, I got this person over the line, now they can live however they want. No, this is God's purpose and direction of them bearing and multiplying the image of God. Now, if you continue that process, you see Genesis, the statement of the Great Commission. In Genesis, go forth, multiply, fill the earth with the image of God. You see God's process through the Great Commission, go and make disciples, image bearers of God. And then we jump to the end, to Revelation. And in Revelation, this is what John says. He says, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Fulfillment. God's purposes fulfilled. The whole earth. How do we know it's the whole earth? John looked out and he saw people from every tongue and tribe and nation. And how did he know that they were from every tongue and tribe and nation? Because they probably looked different. Like each one of them looked different. They might have been wearing different, they have different, the look is different, the language is different. And there's something incredibly beautiful about how culture, the gospel actually expresses itself in culture. We were having this conversation around the table here a little earlier. One of the most beautiful things about the gospel and Christianity is the only religion that doesn't necessarily destroy culture. Lamin Sanneh, who is a professor out of Yale and was from Africa, was responding to this argument in Africa that Christianity would come and kill the culture of Africa. And Lamin Sanneh said, no, Christianity is the one faith that actually does the opposite. It actually allows culture to flourish. And I love his quote. He says this, he says, Africans, and when describing faith in Africa, he talked, Africans sense in their heart that Jesus did not mock their respect for the sacred or their clamor for an invincible Savior. So they beat their sacred drums for him until the stars skipped and danced in the skies. And after that dance, the stars weren't little anymore. And he says this, and I love this quote, Christianity helped Africans to become renewed Africans and not remade Europeans. Okay, let me say that again. Christianity helped Africans to become renewed Africans and not remade Europeans. What's he saying? There's something beautiful about the uniqueness of how the gospel comes into culture and allows people to become whole. And that's just a bigger picture of this this is a picture of that, right? How God uniquely shows up and the gospel shows up where we're at on this journey of faith. That's God's purpose. That's God's mission, to fill the earth with the image of God. So bear the image of God. Multiply the image of God. Statement of the Great Commission. And thirdly, I just want to touch it, and our sister here asked about what the whole gospel is. Well, this is part of the whole gospel. Subdue and rule the earth. Now let's stop and think about that statement for a second. When was it given? It was given pre-fall. Now this always puts my nose, right? God had created creation, all of creation. He said it's good. And he created man, he said it's very good. And we think of creation being perfect. Now what does the word subdue mean? What does the word subdue mean? When you think of subdue, what does it mean? You know? Sorry? Take authority? Okay, what do you take authority over? Okay? When you think about subduing, like I'm thinking about if I'm going to subdue my kids, I'm usually going to grab them and sit down and hold them, right? They're out of control. There's a wildness to them. And what does God is telling us to take that's what's wild. And you see the idea of even the garden. And you see the problem. If you carry the theme out for a garden to the city, there's development that happens. But think about it. This is before the fall. God tells us to subdue and rule the earth. And if you follow creation, it's about putting form and filling things. It's literally making things better. Now this sounds almost blasphemous, but at some level, God told Adam and Eve before the fall to take his creation and make it better. Now you stop and think about that, right? Now that's God's purpose. Pre-fall, of course, since after the fall, everything becomes broken. God's call for us is to, and in his redeemed community is to see that purpose. So this is what I love about it. If you study history, especially history of the church, wherever the church went, things got better. It went genuinely with the gospel. I'm not talking about Christianity. Okay? In fact, sometimes I think Christianity is one of the greatest betrayals of the teachings of Jesus. But when the true gospel and the teachings of Jesus went out, places were transformed. Why? Because people knew that when they showed up, they're going to teach and share the gospel. They're going to proclaim the gospel. But part of their calling was actually to make things better around them. Now, I come from India, and one of my favorite people in history in India was a guy named William Carey. Now, William Carey was the father of modern missions. Came from England. And William Carey was called by God to go to India and to be a missionary in India. So he went out at great cost and ended up costing his wife passed away, they ended up losing kids. A great cost went into India. And he began to share the gospel. He translated the Bible into 40-some different languages. Okay. But you know one thing, not just one thing, some of the other things that William Carey did? William Carey introduced the steam engine into India. He introduced the library system into India. He introduced horticulture into India. I come from Portland, the land of tree huggers. He was the original tree hugger. He lobbied for the conservation of forests in Burma. The man introduced schools for girls. He started the civil service system in India. I mean, he fought against some of the injustices where brides were tossed onto the fires of their husbands who'd been passed away. I mean, he was a man who saw the gospel as more than just a proclamation, living it out and seeing communities transformed by it. You know, I think it was 1993, in the nation of India, the Hindu nation of India, issued a postage stamp in honor of William Carey. Because of the impact of his life. Broadly in the nation, it was recognized. And you know, in India, if you go to India, India's population, especially among educated Indians, the Christian population is less than 1%. But the best schools in India, the best hospitals in India, you go down that list, are started by believers. Why? Because they believe that the call of the gospel was actually to make things better, to subdue and rule the earth as well. Practically speaking, there's a church in Edina, Minnesota, a church that was an aging church, older congregation, had some property, they sold the property, they want to do something with it. And one of the things they did with it, they started a venture competition in Edina, Minnesota. They wanted to get businesses started that would actually address some of the social needs in the community. They started this venture competition. They started 7 businesses that addressed issues like food deserts. They bought a couple of school buses, actually city buses, converted them into mobile gardens and mobile groceries rather, and drove them around the neighborhood and addressed issues of food insecurity. They addressed issues of payday lending, the issues of education, etc. You name it. There were actually 7 businesses they started. They did good in the neighborhood. And all of a sudden, guess what's happening? Young people are showing up in the church. And the church saw an influx of people who were millennials that started showing up. Why? Because the church is relevant. And I think this goes to the fact that God wants us to, even as we engage with these people, the question, a lot of if you remember the video, people were asking, well, you guys say one thing and you do something different. If Christianity is true, then things should change around us. In fact, Gandhi from India was once asked, why do you dislike Jesus? And he said, no, I don't dislike Jesus. You Christians I don't like. Because you look nothing like Jesus. You're not doing the things that Jesus would do. The question is, what would Jesus do? Right? One of my friends in Washington, D.C. is a gal named Aditi. Aditi used to run, she used to be in the Obama administration, used to run all the policy for LGBTQ. And she's not a believer. But she's an amazing thing. Aditi cares, she's an Indian American. and she cared about doing good in India. I cared about doing good in India. And part of the way that I could actually engage with her, if I feel like I used to lead a think tank in Washington, D.C. that addressed the issue of education in India. How do you educate 700 million Indians, right, who are under the age of 30? Does God care about that? Absolutely, God cares about that. And when we're engaged with the things that God cares about, a person like Aditi, I mean, how else am I going to connect with her? We talked about the places where we can connect with people. We've got to find places to connect. And if we engage with the whole gospel, if we engage with the part of the gospel that God says we're called to make things better wherever we are, we're actually going to see more people that we're connecting with and engaging with. So bearing the image of God, multiplying the image of God, and making the world better. We talk about the whole gospel. That's God's purpose. And that's what God is working on. And as we do that, I really do believe that we're going to be engaged with people, all these people, because the gospel is big enough to engage with all of them. I'll invite Tara back up.
It's me this time.
Oh.
Thanks, Jake. I'm sure